We are starting a new series today, and before we start, I have something I need you to see. So Joshua, if you would please. First time I saw this, it was captioned, "Wait for it." Appropriate title. Oh. So is that a random enough video for you? Yeah, you can watch that. It just I just Google or go to YouTube and just dog pushes cat in a tub. That's actually how I found it when I wanted it. How many of you have cats? Just a show of hands. Most of us do. Wow. Okay, close enough. And so we get cat behavior. Cats are kind of weird. You know, dogs are a pet. Really, when you have a cat, you become a pet, I think. At least in their mind, certainly. They tend to be, I think surly is the word I'm looking for. How many of you have cats that like to swim? Sometimes you do get the occasional cat who likes to swim, but most of the time, cats do not like to swim. Have you ever felt like the cat that just got shoved in the bathtub? You're curious about what's going on. You're there sharing your curiosity with, your housemate, slobbering four-legged dog that he is, and all of a sudden he just shoves you in the bathtub. You did not want to go there. You ever feel like life is kind of that way? Like life is filled with random occurrences, but they seem to usually be against you, not for you. You ever had a random occurrence that went your way? Most of the time, those random, surprising, coincidental occurrences go against us, and we kind of, a lot of times, we live our lives feeling like that's our life. My life is just a series of random events, one after the other, and most of them are not in my favor. Most of them are me being shoved into something I don't want to do, don't want to go to. Believers or unbelievers, it doesn't really matter at this point, because that's just kind of how sometimes life feels to all of us. If God is there, we feel like he is silent. We're hoping he's not absent, but we feel like he is silent. And that's not, you say, well, that's a really almost like borderline sacrilegious thing to say, and you're in church. Yeah, I know. I remember walking in. But isn't that how we sometimes feel? Like life is random. It's not going my way. And if God is there, he's been really quiet. Like really not driving the car, really not steering the boat, my life at least. It just feels like I'm kind of spinning out of control. And I wouldn't say it's every day, but I think that we've all been there at some point in our lives, haven't we? That we just felt like things were just too random, that God was just not paying attention. We feel a lot like the cat in the pool, or the cat in the video. As we start this morning, and I'd invite your attention to Esther chapter 1. We do have the verses on the screen, but we're going to go to Esther. As we start Esther, one of the great things I like about the book of Esther is its uniqueness. Esther is unique among most of the books of the Bible, and for several reasons. First of all, and probably the biggest one, is that Esther features a female heroine. You don't have that often in Scripture. Usually the people who dominate our Bible stories, our Scripture stories, are men. And as far as like books of the Bible, this joins only Ruth, being two that are about a woman primarily. Esther is unique because it's recorded actually in Persia. It's not something, events that were recorded in Israel. It's events that were recorded in Persia. Time-wise, if you think about kind of like the main story arc of the Bible, you have this kingdom era, roughly 400 years, where Israel is under a king. They are eventually defeated by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and then they go through this period of about 70 years where they're in exile. This is, excuse me, kind of on the tail end of that exilic period. Already there have been some folks who have, with the blessings of Persia, have left from Babylon and Persia and returned to Israel. But there are still large Jewish communities in Babylon, still large Jewish community in Susa or Shushan, depending on your translation, same city, in Persia, the capital city of Persia. And there's still a large Jewish community there. And so it's kind of unique in that, like Daniel, which we just wrapped up, it's actually being written from an area outside of Israel about events that took place outside of Israel. So you have that. Another uniqueness of the book of Esther is that it doesn't mention God. Like you won't find most books of the Bible, all books of the Bible, except for Esther largely, have God appear somewhere in a very dominant way, in a very forceful way, in a very prominent, in a very at least named kind of way. You actually don't get that in Esther. And so Esther kind of parallels sometimes those periods of our lives where we feel like life is random, because there are a lot of things that are in Esther that seem random, and it seems like maybe God is silent, and we see that in Esther. There's nothing that is prominent where God is saying or doing anything. But the real importance of the book of Esther for us, especially in those times in our lives where we're feeling like maybe God is silent and life is random, is to see that what looks like random on the surface is not in fact random, and what sounds like silence from God is in fact not silence. That God is still active, and that life is not random. He's still got it all in control. And so sometimes we may feel like a cat that's swimming across the pool, but if we'll follow God's direction, even when we're swimming across the pool, we can have confidence in knowing that He's actually directing our paths. And that's really the kind of the main lesson that we get from the book of Esther. And so as we go to Esther, we find that God is neither silent nor absent, and life isn't as random as we think it is. And so let me begin in Esther chapter 1. We're going to pick up in verse 1. Seems like a good place to start a new book, right? Esther 1:1. And we're actually going to go right through about the middle of chapter 2. I won't read it all to you, I promise, but we do need to read some here and there. Verse 1, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Now, Ahasuerus was the king of Persia. Ahasuerus is a Hebrew name. It's the Hebrew formation of his name. The Greek name is the name that we know this particular king better by, and his Greek name would have been Xerxes. And so you can take either one. I'll use the two names interchangeably, Xerxes or Ahasuerus. You'll see both. But at any rate, so this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now, if you'll remember, right at the end of Daniel, Cyrus organized the Persian government into 120 provinces. There has been some expansion going on between Cyrus and Xerxes, and now there are 127 provinces as things have continued to expand. Verse 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, or the palace, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And so these verses provide us with the setting for the story, and that's kind of an important place to go, an important thing to look at. As we look at this particular setting, we have some semblance of an idea what's going on here. For 180 days, there is a council that's being convened. Historically, what we're looking at, in all probability, is the planning stages for the expansion into Thrace. About the third year of Xerxes' reign, he expanded the kingdom to the west, further into Greece, heading into and attacking Thrace. I think we have a map here, Joe. Do we have the map on there? A little bit hard to see, but the purple on the right-hand side of that is the Persian Empire under Cyrus, and the different colors are the different kings as they've been adding. Up into the top and the left there, kind of in the reddish color, you see the word Thrace, just to the east side of the Black Sea there. And this is the area that Xerxes added to the Persian Empire during his reign. This happened about the third year. And so historically, they convened a large gathering of all of the princes, of all the satraps, gathered in to discuss battle planning to conquer Thracian. The Greek warriors were fierce even in these days. You figure, if you know your secular history, the Persian Empire gave way to which empire? The Greek Empire, right? And this happens in our intertestamental period. But so he forayed into Thrace, but eventually the Greeks would rally and drive all the way across Persia, defeating the Persian Empire. But for this moment, it's the other way. And so Xerxes is planning this attack going up into Thrace, planning on how they would reorganize as they add another province to the Persian government. All this is going on for roughly 180 days. And so it's a bit of a celebratory thing. It's a bit of a tactical thing. It's a bit of a civil planning thing. All of which in Persia equals a party. The Persians were a very spiritual people, and one of the things that they used in their planning process was great sums of alcohol. It sounds strange to you and I, but they actually thought that if they could get drunk, they would have greater access to the spirit realm, and so they would make plans. So, how many of you ever looked at the can and said, Budweiser? That's more like Bud Dumber. Because you take too much of that, it doesn't tend to make you smarter. It tends to make you dumber. But it worked for the Persians. I don't get it. So for 180 days, you could call it a party or you could call it a planning session. It's a fine line, really, for them, which side of this is. After 180 days of this inebriated planning, they decide to have a party proper, and so they have a 7-day feast that they're doing, and it's just kind of a they've got the whole strategy set, everything's ready to go. Let's have one great big party to stoke our fortitude and our courage, and then we'll go execute the plan that we've put together. And so this is the setting that's going on here in Persia. Sets the stage then for the first of what is two random promotions. Two random promotions. The first promotion actually happens to a woman named Vashti. Now Vashti is the queen. As fate would have it, she's the queen. And this party gets a little bit out of hand, and we know this, we can see it. The men are, we're told, partying outside in the king's garden, the king's palaces. Meanwhile, Vashti is actually throwing her own kind of probably more ladylike, civilized tea party, whatever it may have looked like, indoors for the women of the palace, the rest of the women who made up the harem that she would have been a part of. And as this was going on, as the party outside was in full force, and these guys who've basically spent the last 6 months drinking so they could plan are now in earnestly drinking so they can party, and you've got to get a little bit further along. And so this is like a, sloppy, drunken mess. This would be all over Fail Army on YouTube. This would be crazy, right? And this is what's going on in Persia. And Xerxes decides that he is going to bring the queen out and parade her before his gathered lords and nobles. Now, this is unusual. This is very unusual in his day because the queen was seen basically as the prized property of the king. Women weren't necessarily held in high esteem. He had a harem, but the queen, she was his wife, she was his queen, and she was actually the one where you weren't allowed to look at. Protocol was you would never directly look at the queen. She when she was outside of the palace, she was carried around in a covered litter. She was just not allowed to see the queen. And so many of most of the men who were gathered here had never seen her, and none of them had dared to look directly at her, because to look directly at the queen was to risk having your eyeballs ripped out of your eyes. I mean, the Persians were no qualms about that. You want to look at the queen? That'll be the last thing you ever see. And so this is something, it's just very unusual, but Xerxes, clearly intoxicated, has decided he's going to bring the queen out, and rather than according her that honor of secrecy that she normally had, he's going to parade her out in front of all the guys who were there. And ladies, you can imagine being paraded out in front of a crowd of drunk men. How much fun that was going to be. And so Vashti decides she's not going to go. And so the king calls for his wife, for his queen, and she says, "No, you're drunk, you're being an idiot, no." Now, we don't know that's what she really said, but she definitely thought that, right, ladies? And so she's like, "I'm not going." Now, this is a serious breach of etiquette. When the king says do something, you do it. It's just the way it is. Now, granted, Persia, they had the laws of the Medes and Persians, which don't change, but who made those laws? The king. Who enforced those laws? The king. And, so it's a bad combination to go, not feeling it. Because the king, his word was law. And so when you decide that, no, I'm not going to come out, I'm not going to see the king, I'm going to defy him, you could call it a breach of protocol, a breach of etiquette, or you could just call it bad decision-making process for your continued existence here on planet Earth. And so Xerxes was, gentlemen, imagine this, he was ashamed because his wife has just publicly defied him, and he is, well, he's that too, angry. What would you be? Right? This makes sense. We get this. This is just a normal, process. You're going to dishonor me in front of my friends? And he gets angry. And he decides in his anger and in his haste, something has to be done. And so he turns to the men who are closest to him. Now, the men who are closest to him are his closest counselors. They're the guys who they're closest to him drunk, because they're also closest to him sober. These are the guys who are closest to him all the time. And he turns to them and he asks, "What should we do? What should be done?" He's angry, but he wants to make an informed decision about what comes next, apparently. And we get advice given to Xerxes. And it's down to verse 16. And I'll read it because you wouldn't believe it if I didn't read it to you. A guy named Memucan comes up with what is easily the most chauvinistic advice possible. Memucan answered before the king in verse 16 and the princes, "Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. She didn't just wrong you, king, she's wronged all of us." You think, what in the world is he thinking about? He'll tell us. "For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come.'" He's like, all the women of the land are going to hear this, and we are all going to have problem at home now, thanks to your wife, king. Ladies, feel free to chuckle. Gentlemen, feel free to be ashamed to be a guy. This is just, it's crazy. "This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath." The wrath and contempt are already there, but this is going to make it worse. We are going to lose our position as the head of our households. Our wives will be increased in their own eyes, and we will be decreased in our eyes, and we are going to have domestic problems, king, because you can't control your wife. Like I said, I had to read this to you. You wouldn't believe it was there if I just tried to tell you. Verse 19, so here's the solution. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of so that it will not be altered. So let's get this down right, firm, and pat. Vashti shall come no more before the king, Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than her. When the king's decree which he will make is proclaimed through all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both small and great. Now there's the guy who's really looking out for his king, isn't he? I'm thinking this guy's wife wasn't there because he'd have been sleeping on the couch or whatever passed for a couch in Persia. And rightfully so. I mean, this is, as answers go, this is about as boneheaded and stupid as it gets. But the thing sat well with Xerxes. He's like, this is a great idea. Again, but dumber. He thought it was a great idea, and so unfortunately, really for everyone, he decides to enact this. So he's going to make a royal decree. He is going to pass a law in response. That Vashti is not going to be the queen. I'm going to find a new queen, a better queen, a more compliant queen. And we're going to publish this. And so not only did they pass the law, they activated their Pony Express and they sent the law out into all the lands. Horses went running in 127 different directions to take this decree. Overkill? Just a little? Crazy much? And so the decree is published, and Vashti finds herself promoted right out of a job. You say, what happened to Vashti? We actually don't know what happened to Vashti at this point. Her part in the story ends, and so Mordecai, as he's writing this, just kind of, focuses the story on where he's going. So, we have a couple possibilities. I'm thinking execution is kind of high up on those list of possibilities. Exile is kind of high up on those list of possibilities. She could have just been, just like thrown into the back of the harem and left there to just be forgotten. We don't know. And so I'm not going to even venture an idea for you as to what it might have been. Scripture doesn't say, so I'm not going to say. But what is clear is that Vashti has earned this promotion right on out of a job. And then we find the promotion of another person into this job. And the person who's going to be promoted into this job is our titular character here in Esther. And we find it beginning in chapter 2 that the king finally calmed down a bit and realized, probably a couple days after he got over his hangover, that maybe he had overreacted, but what is he going to do at this point? Can the king contradict the law of the Medes and the Persians? No. Even the king is bound by the law. So anytime he gets stupid drunk, makes a law, he's stuck with it, as he should be. And so he realizes that this was not necessarily a great idea, but he's going to need a queen. And so they actually start off, kind of an American Idol caliber search for a new queen. His advisors recommend to him, probably the same guys, because it smacks of their kind of advice, to round up all the virgins in all the land and bring them to the castle, and then the king can audition them one at a time. Great idea. I mean, this guy's just going from strength to strength, isn't he? But this is what he decides, and so they start rounding up the young women and virgins from around the kingdom and bringing them to the palace, and they're given to the chief of the eunuchs, and they're given time to prepare themselves, to beautify themselves, to get ready, and then they're going to be auditioned before the king, to see if they would be the queen. Now, if you've read a bit and you're thinking, wow, this sounds like a familiar story. Have you ever heard of 1001 Arabian Nights? Anybody heard of that story? This sounds a lot like that story. And actually, there's some question. Of course, literary scholars go back and forth. They don't really like the thought that this might have been the source material for that, but in all probability it was. And so the similarities are not accidental. This happened much earlier than Arabian Nights was written. But there's a lot of similarities here. Of course, in this one, the women who auditioned for queen didn't get killed in the morning. They just got moved into the harem. And so there are some marked differences, too, between the story. But just so if you go, wow, that sounds oddly familiar. Yeah, it should, because this is really the frame story from 1001 Arabian Nights. And so it's in this context, then, of these women who are essentially auditioning for the role of queen that we are introduced to Esther in Esther chapter 2, picking up beginning in verse 5. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So we get some historical context about who these people are, where they're from. These are refugees essentially from Judah, the people who'd been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar. They'd been to move to Babylon, and then a large contingent of them had been moved from Babylon to Susa and really throughout Persia as the Persian Empire overcame the Babylonian Empire. And so we have this kind of history going on. As we said, at this point in time, some of those families have actually returned to Jerusalem. And so the captivity was kind of on the waning edge here. But at any rate, in verse 5, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So what does that make her? Somebody quickly? Thank you, his cousin. So he is clearly older than Esther, but with her parents being dead for whatever reason, now he is looking after her as father to daughter, kind of a relationship that they have. For she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So we get a sense of their relationship. Verse 8, so it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. And so we are introduced to Esther, basically a refugee orphan who was young but attractive. And so it's an odd combination, but that's what she had working for her. And so she gets caught up in this Persian idol audition for the role of queen, and she gets dragged into the palace, and she's put under the command of Hegai, who is the chief of the eunuchs, who's taking care of all of these women. Now, Esther, we're told, if we were to continue reading, Esther is brought into the palace, but she doesn't tell anybody her lineage. She doesn't, though we've been apprised that she is a Jewish young lady, she doesn't tell them that. And again, Persia, like Babylon, like America, like many of the major empires of the world, had become a bit of a melting pot. People were there from all over the world, and people looked different all over the place. People intermarried, and so what you look like, where you're from, is not necessarily, one, important, or two, easy to tell. And so she gets moved into this, and she's brought in, doesn't tell anybody. Now Mordecai, this will make sense to you, especially to you dads. Mordecai, who has this father-daughter relationship with Esther, is concerned for her welfare, and wants to hear of the news, what's going on. And so he becomes kind of this permanent pacing presence right outside the palace. He's kind of moves to the steps of the palace, and he kind of hovers, he hangs around, he paces. He's there. He's just waiting for news of what's happening with Esther. He doesn't know what's going on any more than anybody else does. He's concerned for her safety, and so absent any place else to be, that's where he is, as often as he can be most of the time. And so the audition of the women takes place, and you move forward about a year. One after another, women are going in for one night with Xerxes, and the next day they're moved to a different house. They're moved to basically moved into the harem, but they're moved into a second house. And this progresses on, and it's gone night after night after night. Finally, it becomes Esther's turn to go in. Now, each of the women, as they go in to meet with the king, are allowed to take one thing, one bauble, one trinket, one point of interest. And so Esther actually asks Hegai, what should I take in? And she goes in very simply for her audition, as it were, with the king. And so we pick up in Esther chapter 2, verse 15. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. So she just took whatever was given to her, no great demands. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her, which tells you something about her personality. You ever heard the expression that beauty is on the surface, but ugly is to the bones? However that goes. That's really not true. You ever met a person who was very beautiful on the inside, or on the outside rather, but very ugly on the inside? It finds a way of shining through, doesn't it? A lot of pretty people, beautiful people, are really quite ugly, and after a very short amount of time, that ugly kind of comes out. And so the fact that here is Esther, she is attractive on the outside, we're told. She wouldn't have been in this process at all if she wasn't. But more importantly, she is attractive on the inside. That the people who are dealing with her, she's been here now for a year, the people who are dealing with her day in and day out continue to find her an attractive person. Beauty gets old after a real short while if it's an ugly person. But she's not. And so the people find her. And so we find something about her as a person, that she is beautiful on the inside, that she's an attractive person. She's easy to get along with, and somebody that you're just naturally drawn to like. And so these are all good things for her. Verse 16, so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And so now we're 4 years out from where this whole process started with the planning council where Vashti was overthrown. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now Hebrew tradition would tell us that as she went in, the way that she won the king's heart was by telling him stories. And again, the similarity with the Arabian Nights is intentional on the writer's part there, that she began to tell him the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, those great stories that still stoke our imagination as we read them from the book of Genesis and we move on into Exodus, and that she just simply, humbly, pleasantly began to take a different tack probably than a lot of the other women had who entered his presence. And not intimidated, she just went in and she just told him stories, sought to entertain him, sought to just be herself and who she was in her presence without revealing too much. It's clear as you read on that he doesn't know she's Jewish. He just knows she's good with stories. And so she actually pleases the king, and he decides that he's going to make her his queen. So he puts the crown on her head, verse 18. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants. And he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. And so we find this promotion of Esther from this kind of refugee orphan hanging out in kind of a marginalized cultural center in Shushan to now being the queen, really, of the known world. I mean, Xerxes' reign, you saw the picture of the area he controlled. It was not a small kingdom. It was not a small empire that he controlled. And she's suddenly the queen of this empire. She's been promoted. And it's a great rags to riches kind of a story. I mean, this is like Disney caliber. Her mom even died. This is Disney caliber stuff. Sorry, that's kind of an inside joke. We always say with Disney movies, the mom dies. Does seem to be one of the things they use. But anyway, that she's just gone from nobody to somebody very important, from rags and whatever she could find to this very wealthy, people attending to her every desire night and day as she is the queen of Persia. Not too bad. And we need to stop there because otherwise, we'd be here through this evening. Taken just as they are, these two promotions seem very random to us. The promotion of Vashti to be, out into freedom wherever that led her. The promotion of Esther, it seems random. We like this particular kind of random because it's the rags to riches kind of random, and we think, well, that's cool. We are attracted to that. And I don't want to spoil the story too much, especially if you don't know the end of the story of Esther here, but there is some bits that we need to kind of fill in for this to really begin to really begin to make sense. Because there's absolutely nothing random about Esther's promotion to queen. As we'll see over the next several weeks, the Jewish people are getting ready to face an extinction-level threat, akin to Adolf Hitler and what he tried to do with the Jews. He was not the first. He won't be the last. This is the level of threat they faced, or were getting ready to face. But as it was in Esther's day, the threat had not yet emerged. In fact, the man who would be the source of that threat had not even yet been promoted into the position of influence where he could start the ball rolling. We step back several steps from that. But here's what we find. God, who is not named in the book of Esther, who would almost seem to be asleep at the wheel in the book of Esther, at least to the people, to the readers, that God was actually directing these random events. And the reason they seem random is because the context that would make these events make sense had not yet emerged. He was a couple of years ahead of the threat. The people of Israel were going to need deliverance in the future. They did not need it yet. The threat had not emerged yet, but they were going to need deliverance, and so God had already begun to move the person into place who was going to be the source of that deliverance. And so these random events, we'll find out, were not random at all. It's just that the context that made them make sense had not happened yet, had not emerged yet. And so they still seem random. Which brings me back to our lives. We sometimes, and we talk about it, sometimes life feels and seems random. You ever felt like just something was going on, it was going against you, it felt random, and it felt like God just was not directing traffic at all? We've all been there. And I think the great lesson that we see here in Esther is that in those moments where life seems random and God seems silent, we need to have the faith that says life is not random and God is not silent. But the context that's going to make all this make sense hasn't emerged yet. Like, I don't understand what's going on that's making these random stuff make sense, but I know that something is. And in Esther's life and in the story as we progress, as we continue on the next several weeks, we'll see that context emerge, and we'll see what God actually was doing. We get a great snapshot that he was way out ahead of the problem. He had the solution in motion before the problem was in motion. And I wonder how many times we just don't see that. We don't always, even in the context of our own lives, we don't always have sufficient context to say, this made sense now. There's a story, I've told this before. A few years ago and a few cars ago, we had, it was a Dodge Caravan. We were in Foxborough, and I don't even know what we were doing. It was like a Saturday or something. And you know the rotary there, I say it's a rotary, it's kind of this rectangular monster rotary there in Foxborough. And we were on 140, and we were heading back to Franklin. Give you an idea where we were going, kind of opposite the Orpheum Theater and all that stuff there. So we're coming back through there, and I've got, Kate's with me, and the kids are all there. This is, 5-6 years ago? So our kids are considerably younger, fewer of them. And so we're going along, and all of a sudden we get a flat tire in the van. Now, fortunately, there's several houses along there on the right-hand side. We pulled off into a parking area there, just intent on changing the tire. So far, this seems pretty normal, right? Flat tire, not a big deal exactly. I'm not sure who designed the Dodge Caravan, but I think they were an idiot. Because the spare tire on a Dodge Caravan is mounted underneath the van. It's a space saver. I mean, the thing's not in your way when you're trying to put groceries in the back. But in New England, we throw a fair amount of salt and product on the road every winter. And so the undercarriage of all of our vehicles is a bit of a mess. And the van was no exception to that. The spare tire, according to the owner's manual, which I actually had to finally get out and read after about a half hour of trying unsuccessfully, got the owner's manual out. I am a guy. It's just part of the deal. So, I'm finally reading the instructions, and I'm like, okay, so this is a really simple process. You put the thing in here, you turn it this way, the tire drops off. That's the way it's designed to work. But the problem is, it was not working as designed. In fact, it was not working at all. I put the thing in there, turned it this way, kept turning. Nothing happened. Like, it is completely seized up. It's completely frozen. So I'm underneath the van. Now, when you're underneath a van, one, you don't want it on the jack because that's just, crazy. But so there's not a lot of room down there, not a lot of leverage. I'm trying to yank the spare tire off of its mount, and it's just not moving. And we were there. I mean, a change of tire should take, 10, 15 minutes, guys? Roughly, if you're slow and clean. And 2 hours. And for reasons I don't understand, it finally came off. And I was finally able to swap out the tire and go. I was less than thrilled, as you might imagine, as you hear my wife cackling. I was not a real happy camper. I'd love to tell you that, all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And so I just trusted God that he knew what he was doing and that life was good and we would move on. I would love to be able to tell you that, but I'd be lying. So I won't tell you that. I know that God is in control, but I did not feel like God was in control. I did not act in ways that were demonstrative of a person of faith. I think I griped and complained and moaned and groaned and probably raised my voice and complained some more. You've been there, right? Looking back, I can tell you now confidently that God knew what was going on and that there is no human reason that tire should have not come off. And I fully believe that God, in that random moment in my life, was absolutely in control, even though I wasn't listening. He could have been yelling and I wouldn't have heard him. But that event was not random, and God was not silent. I fully believe that the reason I was there was to protect me from something else. I have no idea what it was. None whatsoever. But I'm convinced it wasn't a random event. I don't know, and I think whatever context would have emerged didn't emerge because I was stuck there. And that the randomness of that moment was God taking care of me before the problem happened. You ever been there? I would love to know what it was. Honestly, I guess I don't care. What did I miss out? Because it wasn't for my good. We serve a God who is ahead of our problems, who does care for his children. Doesn't mean our life is always easy. Doesn't mean it's always perfect. Doesn't mean it always makes sense. It doesn't mean we're going to avoid hardship. I would love to tell you, as some would, that when you worship and serve God, that your life will be great. Again, I would be a liar. Jesus worshiped and served God better than anybody, and he got killed for it because that was the plan. So I can't say that life will always be a bed of roses for you, but what I can say is God is ahead of your problems. And the randomness of your life is not random. And the silence of your Father is not silence. If we could learn to see and learn to hear through eyes of faith, we would see the random silence of God as the intentional acts of a Father who loves us. It's a lot to take in. But some days, where's my cat? Some days, we feel like a cat in a pool, don't we? And we feel like life is random. Those are the hard days to remember that my life is not random and my God is not silent. But those are the days it's absolutely essential to remember it. It's the difference between floundering through life, disillusioned, upset, angry, complaining all the time, and swimming through life, knowing that the path is somewhere below your feet even though you can't see it or reach it. Because your Heavenly Father is guiding your path, is guarding your path, and is directing you on your path. And if we can keep that, we can go through life with a calm assurance that the people around us don't have because they are subjected to their own randomness and they don't have sufficient context for any of it to make sense. Though God is at work in their life just as surely as He is in ours. So how do you choose to live? Angry, upset, random? Or calm, trusting, secure? My hope is, and as we continue the story of Esther, that we'll see we're not cats swimming in a pool. We're children walking along a path. The psalmist summed it up best in Psalm 119, verse 105. Your word is a light unto my path, a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path. We sang the songs. We know the verse. All we have left to do is live it. Father, we thank you. I thank you for Esther. I thank you for her story. I thank you for its simplicity. And yet, its depth of meaning. Father, would you help us to see that our life is not random, that we worship and serve a God who loves us, who directs our paths. Father, as your children, you watch out for us. And Lord, even this morning, for those who are here who aren't your children, who've never entered into relationship with you, who don't know Jesus as their Savior, Father, I believe they are here today because you are guarding and guiding and directing their path just as surely as anybody else's. It's just that their path is to bring them to Jesus. And so while we have not talked long about it, I would ask that your Holy Spirit would work in their hearts to show them where their path is leading them. And for the rest of us, Lord, would you help us to have the faith to trust you, even though life seems random. Help us to know that it's not. Father, we would love to see the context that makes it all make sense. But even if we cannot, would you help us just to know you, to trust you? Well, thank you in Jesus' good name.